Hi there, AP Psychology class. Welcome to part 2 of Unit 9 on development, one of my favorite topics to discuss, cognitive development. And so when we talk about cognition, just to review from previous units, remember that cognition refers to all the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. And so in this slideshow, we're going to look at the development process of cognition in young children. And so the man associated with cognitive development in our discussion of children is Jean Piaget. He was one of the first researchers to show that the thought processes of adults and children were very different. And this actually comes from his work at the Binet Institute in France, where he was administering IQ tests to young kids, and he had realized that there were vast similarities not just in how children of similar age groups answered questions correctly. There were also a lot of similarities in the types of wrong answers that children of particular age groups gave. And so that kind of led him to wonder, like, why is it that, many 5-year-olds will give the same wrong answer to questions when he was administering the test. And so that led him down this, life research of cognitive development. And so the first thing to understand concerning his work in cognition is the terms he uses to explain how we organize our experiences as children. And so the first word there is schemas. And schemas would be what Piaget said we use to organize and interpret our experiences. And so as a child, you were constructing these cognitive concepts. And so think to young children, like toddlers that are acquiring language and are expressing their cognition, will often ask, what's that? What's that? Why? Really, it's that they're taking everything that they are thinking and learning and knowing and organizing it into these schemas. And so this happens through assimilation and accommodation. Whenever you interpret something new in your environment that fits into a schema that you already have, that would be called assimilating or assimilation. When you have to adapt an existing idea or schema to fit a new experience, or if you have to make a new schema because you've encountered something that does not fit in things you already know, that would be called accommodation. So a great example would be, the fact that we have 2 Labrador retrievers at home. And so, Liam is our elder dog, and Charlotte learning that, Liam is a dog. Even though Libby, our younger lab, is a different color than Liam, she still looks a lot like Liam because they're both of the same breed. And so learning that Libby too is a dog would probably have been assimilation. But encountering the neighbor's dog, who is of a different breed, might have required some adaptation to her schema of dog. Okay, so dogs don't all look exactly alike. There can be different breeds of dogs. Pointing to a cat and saying dog because my child had never been exposed to cats until going to family members' houses with cats, that would be accommodation as well. Like, wow, this is a whole new schema that I have to work with. And so most of our cognition at our very young age is just spent organizing our experiences into these schemas using both of those processes. Okay, Piaget's work led to his theory of cognitive development. Now, if you remember from the first video when we talked about one of the controversial issues in developmental psych is this concept of continuity versus stages. And Piaget was very staunch in this, that his theory is a stage theory, which means that there are specific tasks or tests that you must complete before you would be moved on to the next stage or level. It's not fluid, it's very distinct. We'll later talk about one of the main critiques of this theory. that it's probably not as rigid as he had originally outlined. But let's start with stage 1 of the Piaget's theory of development, is the sensor-motor stage. Children at this stage are going to experience, obviously, the world through their motor and sensory interactions with objects. So this stage is, if you want rough age guidelines, is probably between infancy and almost to age 2, according to Piaget. The key here is that they are just learning to interact with their own bodies and how their bodies interact with the environment. And so this is why you find infants being fascinated by doing things like staring at their own hands or jingling keys that are put in front of their face, just trying to understand all the sights and sounds around them and how they can interact with those objects. The test that Piaget felt was important, one of the tests in the sensor-motor stage, was an idea called object permanence. And that's the awareness that things continue to exist even when you cannot see them. And so this would explain why infants are fascinated by a game of peekaboo, because to them, without object permanence, your face is literally disappearing and then reappearing before their very eyes. The understanding that your face is hiding behind your hands is not something that they can grasp until about 8 months of age. So object permanence would be one of the major milestones in this stage, according to Piaget. Okay. One of the critiques here, though, is that this view tends to mean that many people underestimate a young child's competence for things. So that you can consider as critique number 1 of Piaget's theory. We know from research on infants that babies actually have an intuitive grasp of like simple laws of physics, in that they, being shown things that would be physically impossible to happen, like balls falling up and things of that nature, they will actually stare longer. Think back to our first one of habituation versus novelty preference. So even though they haven't experienced a lot of the world just yet, they do seem to understand a lot about their surroundings, maybe more than we give them credit for. Okay, so Piaget would have described the preschool years, probably up until age 6 or so, as being the pre-operational stage of cognitive development. Okay, so they're not quite thinking like an adult, right? They're not quite operational, pre-operational. 2 things that are characteristic of this stage of development are the law of conservation, right? The key properties of an object stay the same. So a great classic example, and I'll show you one of these in class, is, when we take a fluid like water and change its shape by putting it in a different shaped container. It doesn't necessarily mean that we gained any more or lost any of the water, but yet children in this stage often can't grasp that concept. One of the other things that as a characteristic of this stage is the difficulty in perceiving things from another person's point of view, which we call egocentrism. And so we'll do some examples of those in class as well. But for Piaget, the ability to do both of those things, to understand conservation, and then to be less egocentric, which would be developing a theory of mind, which we'll talk about on the next slide, or being able to take another person's point of view, will often be the tests, so to speak, that they have to pass in order to move to the next stage. Okay, the concrete operational stage is going to be adult logical thinking. The issue here, though, is that, and we're talking about elementary school age children, that that the mental operations are like an adult, are logical. They can take other people's point of views. They can think symbolically, but that laws of conservation, right, are all there. But those sorts of things, are only here after the age of 6, according to Piaget. Okay, the only thing that's missing from an elementary school's thought process, according to Piaget, and the difference between that and a high school student, would be the formal operational stage, and that would be around age 12, being able to encompass abstract thinking. That's really the only difference between concrete and formal operational thinkers. But it is a good explanation for why perhaps some children are better equipped, I guess, to understand things like algebra at the 7th grade level, and why some children may struggle with that, because Piaget would argue not all of them have perhaps reached the formal operational stage. Okay, so to conclude our look at cognitive development here, this theory of mind, that's that ability to take another person's point of view, and we know that develops at some point late in the pre-operational stage, and continues to develop, through that concrete operational stage. And so I'll show you some examples of that in class as well. An important real life connection to that is our study of autism. And really, the biggest characteristic of autism as a disorder is a malfunction of brain areas that allow us to take another's viewpoint, right? And so that theory of mind being something that never fully develops in the autistic brain. So some reflections on all of this would be looking at one more cognitive theorist, Lev Vygotsky, who looked at a lot of work that Piaget did, and actually talked about the fact that part of this cognitive development seriously involves social interaction with others, and that Vygotsky actually believed that you had the ability to think more critically, or to think at a higher cognitive level than Piaget had initially thought, simply by having interactions with people that would encourage you to think at a higher level. And so like thinking aloud, instead of relying on inner speech, would be something that was characteristic of a young kid. And then talking to themselves, or teaching kids how to talk to themselves, kind of helps them keep their behaviors and emotions in check, and have the ability to actually master skills that they may not have been able to master without the help of others. So teaching kids inner dialogue versus saying everything or out loud, or blurting things out at the mouth, gives us an ability to mentor them, giving them new things to think about, and providing what Vygotsky called a scaffold, and that's where you can build upon higher level thinking. So Vygotsky basically was saying, just because a young child may not be able to completely understand higher order thinking or higher cognitive processes, that zone of proximal development, he didn't think it was as rigid of stages as Piaget had thought, and that if we can kind of push people outside of their comfort zone by providing them with guidance and scaffolding, that we can actually encourage higher level thinking sooner than Piaget, because of that they can't understand this. Okay, so bring any questions about this that you may have to class. Thanks for listening.